In 1972, humans walked on the moon for the last time. That was over 50 years ago. Since then, we have invented the internet, sequenced the human genome, built reusable rockets, and put a telescope at the second Lagrange point, 1.5 million kilometers from Earth. Yet not a single human being has set foot on the lunar surface since Gene Cernan climbed back into his capsule and left. The common explanation is that we simply lost interest. The real explanation is far more disturbing, far more complex, and far more important to understand, because the reason we have not been back reveals everything about how human civilization actually works when it comes to doing the hardest things. If you enjoy documentaries that challenge what you think you know and reveal the deeper story behind the biggest questions in space, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and I genuinely appreciate every single one of you who supports this channel. Now, settle in and get yourself comfortable. Let's begin. There is a sentence that has done more damage to public understanding of space exploration than almost any other. 6 words, spoken casually at dinner tables, typed with absolute confidence in comment sections, repeated so often across so many decades that it has calcified into something resembling fact. We have already been to the moon. Say it out loud and listen to what it implies. Already, past tense. Completed. Checked off the list. The sentence treats the moon the way you might treat a restaurant you visited years ago. Been there. Know the menu. Could go back any time. On the thinnest surface level, the statement is correct. Between July 1969 and December 1972, 12 human beings walked on the lunar surface across 6 successful landing missions. They planted flags. They collected 842 pounds of rock and soil samples. They deployed scientific instruments. They drove an electric rover across the grey dust. They took photographs that became some of the most iconic images in human history. And then they came home. The Apollo program accomplished one of the most extraordinary feats our species has ever achieved. That is not in dispute. Nobody serious questions whether it happened or whether it mattered. What is in dispute, what should be in dispute, is what Apollo actually proved. Because embedded inside that casual sentence is a deeply misleading assumption. The assumption is that going to the moon once means going again should be relatively straightforward. We cracked the code. We solved the puzzle. We demonstrated the engineering. Surely the hard part is behind us, and all that remains is summoning the collective will to repeat the exercise. This misconception derails nearly every public conversation about why humans have not returned to the lunar surface in over half a century. It treats Apollo as though it were a permanent capability, a technology we developed, validated, and placed neatly on a shelf, ready to be retrieved whenever we decide the moment is right, like a recipe perfected decades ago that simply needs to be followed again. The truth is almost precisely the opposite. And understanding why requires dismantling everything most people think they know about how and why Apollo happened in the first place. Strip away the mythology. Set aside the inspirational speeches and the slow-motion footage of rocket launches and the swelling orchestral soundtracks. Look at Apollo not as a triumph of human aspiration, but as a product of specific historical conditions. When you do that, the picture changes dramatically. Apollo was not a sustainable exploration program. It was a sprint, a magnificent, meticulously engineered, breathtakingly expensive sprint executed under conditions so extraordinary that they may never align again in human history. The program was not designed to open the moon for long-term use. It was designed to get American astronauts to the surface and bring them back alive within the narrowest possible window of time, at nearly any cost, under pressure so intense that normal institutional constraints were temporarily suspended. To understand why those conditions existed, you need to go back to a single moment that rewired American political priorities overnight. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union placed a small aluminium sphere into orbit around Earth. Sputnik weighed only 83 kilograms, It carried no weapons. It performed no meaningful science. All it did was circle the planet every 96 minutes, transmitting a steady radio pulse that anyone with a shortwave receiver could hear. The psychological impact on the United States was seismic. It is difficult from a modern vantage point to appreciate the scale of the shock. America in the late 1950s regarded its technological superiority as a settled matter. The country that had built the atomic bomb industrialized faster than any nation in history, and emerged from the Second World War as the dominant global power assumed that no rival could match its engineering capability. Sputnik shattered that assumption in a single evening. The reaction was not measured or analytical. It was visceral. Congressional hearings were convened within weeks. Newspapers ran front-page editorials comparing the event to Pearl Harbor. Parents wrote anxious letters to elected officials asking whether their children were safe under a sky now patrolled by Soviet technology. Schools overhauled science curricula almost overnight. A national crisis of confidence erupted that touched every level of American society. The fear was not abstract. This was the deep winter of the Cold War. Both superpowers were building nuclear arsenals at a terrifying pace. The logic was straightforward and alarming. If the Soviet Union could place an object in orbit, it could place a nuclear warhead anywhere on Earth. Sputnik was not just a satellite. It was a demonstration of intercontinental ballistic missile capability, dressed in the clothing of peaceful science. Then the situation deteriorated further. On April 12, 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to orbit the Earth. He completed a single orbit in 108 minutes and returned safely. The United States, which had not yet achieved orbital spaceflight, watched from the ground. The strategic implications were enormous. Across the developing world, nations were choosing sides in the Cold War. Technological achievement served as a proxy for ideological legitimacy. Every Soviet milestone in space was a propaganda victory that reverberated through Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The message was clear and devastating. Communism produces results. The Soviet system works. The future belongs to Moscow. This was the environment not of scientific curiosity but of geopolitical terror, in which President John F. Kennedy delivered his address to a joint session of Congress on May 25, 1961. His declaration that America would land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth before the decade was out is remembered today as one of the great aspirational moments in political history. What is less often remembered is the context in which those words were spoken. Kennedy was not primarily interested in space. His private correspondence and recorded conversations reveal a leader who viewed the moon program instrumentally. He understood prestige. He understood leverage. He understood that the United States was losing a contest for global influence and needed a stage large enough and dramatic enough to reclaim the initiative. The moon provided that stage. Nothing else available, no military program, no economic initiative, no diplomatic effort could produce a single, unambiguous demonstration of technological supremacy visible to every nation on Earth. This distinction matters enormously. Apollo was not born from wonder. It was born from fear. Fear of Soviet dominance. Fear of ideological defeat. Fear that the arc of the Cold War was bending away from the West. The urgency was existential in the way that political leaders experience existential threats, not as philosophical abstractions, but as immediate dangers to national survival and global standing. That urgency translated directly and immediately into resources on a scale that has no parallel in peacetime American history. At its peak in 1966, NASA consumed approximately 4.5% of the entire United States federal budget. Sit with that number for a moment. 4.5 cents of every dollar the federal government spent went to the space agency. Adjusted for inflation and expressed in contemporary terms, this represents roughly $150 billion per year. For comparison, NASA's entire annual budget today is approximately $25 billion, representing less than half of 1% of federal spending. Apollo-era NASA received roughly 6 times more funding in real terms than the modern agency. And that funding arrived with a speed and political consensus that would be unrecognizable in today's legislative environment. The money was not spent cautiously. It was spent at a pace that resembled wartime mobilization because in many ways, that is exactly what it was. At the program's height, more than 400,000 people worked on Apollo across roughly 20,000 companies, universities, and government facilities. Engineers at Grumman on Long Island built the lunar module, while engineers at North American Aviation in California built the command and service module, while engineers at Boeing in New Orleans built the first stage of the Saturn V. Engineers at Douglas Aircraft in Huntington Beach built the third stage, while engineers at IBM in Owego built the guidance computers. The supply chain spanned the entire continental United States and represented a concentration of engineering talent that has never been replicated before or since. The work culture bordered on obsessive. 70 and 80-hour weeks were standard. Engineers slept in their offices. Families went months without seeing fathers and mothers who were consumed by the project. Test failures that today would trigger multi-year review processes were analysed, understood, corrected, and moved past in a matter of weeks. The schedule pressure was relentless and intentional. Kennedy's deadline was not aspirational. It was operational. Every decision, every trade study, every design review was measured against the end-of-decade clock. The hardware that emerged from this pressure cooker remains staggering in its ambition. The Saturn V rocket stood 363 feet tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty, including its pedestal. Its 5 first-stage engines generated a combined 7.5 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, consuming 15 tons of kerosene and liquid oxygen every single second. The vehicle could deliver approximately 130 metric tons to low Earth orbit, or roughly 50 metric tons toward the Moon. It remains the most powerful launch vehicle ever successfully flown. Nothing built since, not the Space Shuttle, not the Falcon Heavy, not even the Space Launch System matches its raw payload capability. Every Saturn V was expendable. The entire rocket, from the massive first stage to the tiny instrument unit, was used once and discarded. There was no reuse, no refurbishment, no consideration of long-term economy. Each launch consumed a vehicle that cost approximately $1.5 billion in today's money. The program burned through 13 Saturn V rockets across the Apollo missions, plus additional vehicles for uncrewed tests and Skylab. Each one was a masterpiece of engineering built to fly once and then fall into the ocean or crash into the Moon. This expendability reveals something critical about Apollo's design philosophy. The entire architecture was optimized for a singular objective: get crews to the lunar surface and bring them home. Not repeatedly. Not economically. Not sustainably. Once. Prove it can be done. Win the political contest. Move on. The lunar module exemplified this philosophy with almost brutal clarity. It was designed to support 2 astronauts on the lunar surface for approximately 72 hours. It carried enough oxygen, water, and power for that duration, plus modest contingency reserves. The descent stage contained the engine and landing gear that brought the crew to the surface. The ascent stage contained the crew cabin and a single engine that launched them back to lunar orbit for rendezvous with the command module. That ascent engine, the one that had to fire perfectly to get the crew off the Moon, had no backup. There was no redundant propulsion system, no secondary engine, no alternative means of returning to orbit. If the ascent engine failed to ignite, the crew would die on the lunar surface. Full stop. There was no rescue capability, no contingency vehicle, no plan beyond a pre-written presidential eulogy. President Richard Nixon had exactly such a statement prepared for the Apollo 11 mission. Speechwriter William Safire drafted remarks titled, "In event of moon disaster that began, fate has ordained that the men who went to the Moon to explore in peace will stay on the Moon to rest in peace." The speech was not a formality. It was a genuine contingency for an outcome that mission planners considered plausible. The risk tolerance embedded in Apollo is almost impossible to comprehend from a modern perspective. Internal NASA analyses from the era suggest that the probability of crew loss on any individual mission ranged from approximately 1 in 20 to 1 in 10, depending on the mission phase and the specific flight. Some credible analyses placed early mission risk even higher. Across the full program, the cumulative probability that at least one crew would be lost was considered substantial. The astronauts understood these odds intimately. They were test pilots, men whose professional lives involved strapping into experimental aircraft with non-trivial chances of killing them. They accepted the risks not out of recklessness, but out of a culture that regarded risk acceptance as inseparable from the mission. Many of them later described their relationship with danger in terms that would trigger immediate psychological evaluation in any modern crew selection process. And the broader society accepted these risks too, or at least tolerated them, because the stakes of the Cold War demanded tolerance. The potential cost of losing the space race, ceding global technological leadership to the Soviet Union, was perceived as greater than the potential cost of losing astronauts. This calculus was never stated so bluntly in public speeches, but it operated beneath the surface of every budget allocation, every schedule decision, every design trade that favored performance over redundancy. This is a crucial point that separates Apollo from everything that came after. The program operated in a political environment where failure to achieve the goal was considered more dangerous than failure of the mission. That inversion of normal institutional priorities, where the political cost of not trying exceeded the political cost of crew loss, created conditions under which extraordinary risks could be accepted and extraordinary budgets could be justified. Remove that inversion and the entire foundation of Apollo collapses, which is precisely what happened. Consider how radically the environment has shifted. After the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart 73 seconds after launch on January 28, 1986, killing all 7 crew members, the shuttle fleet was grounded for 32 months. A presidential commission investigated, design changes were mandated, launch procedures were overhauled. The institutional trauma was profound and lasting. After the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated during re-entry on February 1, 2003, killing all 7 crew members, the fleet was grounded again, this time for over 2 years. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board produced a sweeping report that examined not just the technical cause but the organizational culture that allowed known risks to be normalized. The shuttle program never fully recovered. It was retired 8 years later. These responses were appropriate. They reflected a mature recognition that human lives should not be spent casually in pursuit of programmatic objectives. But they also demonstrate why the Apollo pace of operations is structurally impossible in a modern democratic society. A single crew loss today would not merely delay a program, it would likely halt human deep space exploration for a generation. Congressional investigations would stretch across years, public confidence would crater, institutional risk aversion would intensify to levels that make ambitious missions unfundable. Apollo operated in a narrow historical window where political urgency outweighed institutional caution. That window opened with Sputnik and closed almost the moment Neil Armstrong's boot touched the regolith. By the time Apollo 11 succeeded, the political objective had been achieved. The race was won. The Soviet Union never landed cosmonauts on the moon. American technological supremacy was demonstrated on the largest possible stage. And with the political objective accomplished, the political will to continue evaporated almost immediately. The cancellation began before the program was even complete. Apollo missions 18, 19, and 20 were cut from the manifest, not because the hardware was unavailable. Saturn V rockets and lunar modules were already in various stages of production, but because Congress refused to continue funding missions. Political purpose had been served. The rockets existed. The astronauts were trained. The missions were cancelled anyway. This is perhaps the most telling detail in the entire Apollo story. The United States possessed the physical capability to continue flying to the moon and chose not to. The decision was not technical, it was political. The moon had served its purpose as a stage for Cold War competition, and there was no domestic constituency powerful enough to sustain a program whose original rationale had been fulfilled. What most people miss about this history is how completely it reframes the question of lunar return. The popular framing goes something like this: we went to the moon 50 years ago, so why can we not go back now? The implication is that something went wrong, that we lost capability, lost nerve, lost direction. But the more accurate framing reverses the question entirely. The extraordinary thing is not that we stopped going to the moon. The extraordinary thing is that we went at all. Apollo was an anomaly, a spike in capability driven by a unique convergence of geopolitical crisis, budgetary freedom, cultural mobilization, and institutional risk tolerance that has no precedent and no subsequent parallel. The half-century absence of humans from the lunar surface is not a failure. It is a return to baseline conditions in which no democratic government has the political incentive to spend the required resources on an objective with no immediate strategic payoff. This reframing is not meant to diminish Apollo. The program stands as one of the supreme achievements of human engineering and courage. But treating it as a baseline, as proof that lunar travel is a solved problem that merely requires repetition, fundamentally misunderstands what made it possible. Apollo did not prove that humanity can live on the moon. Apollo proved that under conditions of extraordinary political pressure, unlimited funding, wartime mobilization of industrial capacity, and tolerance for levels of crew risk that would be criminal by modern standards, it is possible to send small teams of extraordinarily brave people on brief visits to the lunar surface and bring most of them home alive. That is a very specific achievement, and it is a very different thing from what modern lunar return requires. The crews of Apollo did not build infrastructure, they did not establish habitats, they did not test long-duration life support systems, or develop in-situ resource extraction, or construct power generation facilities. They landed, performed surface activities for periods ranging from a few hours to 3 days, and departed. The longest continuous human presence on the lunar surface in the entire Apollo program was approximately 75 hours during Apollo 17, 3 days, on a world that humans had spent 3 years and roughly $200 billion inflation-adjusted dollars learning to reach. The analogy is imperfect but instructive. Imagine that in 1969, a team of climbers summited the most dangerous peak on Earth using supplemental oxygen, fixed ropes, and a support structure involving hundreds of porters and logistics personnel. They reached the top, planted a flag, took photographs, collected rock samples, and descended. Then imagine that in the decades that followed, someone proposed building a permanently staffed research station on that summit, and the public responded by saying, "Well, we already climbed it, so what is the problem?" The problem is that reaching a destination once under extreme conditions and establishing a permanent presence, there are fundamentally different undertakings, separated not by degree but by kind. The skills, resources, infrastructure, and institutional commitment required for the second objective bear only superficial resemblance to those required for the first. Apollo was not a foundation upon which sustained lunar presence could be built. Apollo was a self-contained event, brilliant and complete in itself, that left behind almost nothing in terms of reusable capability. The Saturn V production lines were not maintained. The lunar module factories were not kept operational. The workforce was not preserved. The supply chains were not sustained. The institutional knowledge was not transmitted to a next generation of engineers. When Apollo ended, it did not leave a dormant capability waiting to be reactivated. It left a memory, a magnificent, inspiring memory, but a memory nonetheless. And memories, no matter how vivid, cannot fly to the moon. The conditions that made Apollo possible were not merely rare. They were the product of a specific historical moment that combined superpower rivalry, nuclear anxiety, rapid economic growth, demographic momentum, cultural unity around a national objective, and a tolerance for government spending that reflected post-war confidence in federal institutions. Each of these factors was necessary. None was sufficient alone. Their simultaneous alignment created a window of possibility that opened in the early 1960s and began closing the moment Apollo 11 landed. By 1970, the window was effectively shut. NASA's budget was already declining. Public interest in lunar missions was waning. Television ratings for later Apollo flights dropped sharply compared to the first landing. Vietnam War expenditures were consuming an increasing share of federal resources. Domestic priorities, healthcare, education, urban development competed for the funds that Apollo had temporarily monopolized. The Apollo program did not end because it failed. It ended because it succeeded. The political objective was met, and without a political objective of comparable urgency to sustain it, the program had no institutional immune system against the normal forces of budget competition and shifting priorities. This is the core of the misconception that has haunted public discourse about space exploration for 50 years. People look at Apollo and see proof that the engineering works. What they should see is proof that a singular alignment of political, financial, industrial, and cultural conditions can produce results that are inherently unrepeatable once those conditions dissolve. The Apollo missions did not build a road to the moon. They built a bridge made of political urgency and wartime budgets, and that bridge was dismantled behind them the moment the last astronaut stepped off the lunar surface. What was lost in that dismantling turns out to be far more than most people realize, and that story begins with the factories that went silent and the engineers who walked away. Most people imagine that after Apollo, NASA simply turned its attention elsewhere. The shuttle program took priority. Low Earth orbit became the new frontier. The moon was placed on pause, not abandoned, just deferred. The assumption is that the capability to return sat quietly in storage, like a classic car under a tarp in a garage, waiting for someone to turn the key. This is wrong in ways that are difficult to overstate. What happened after Apollo was not a redirection. It was a demolition. Begin with the most tangible loss, the Saturn V. The Saturn V was not preserved as an operational system. It was not mothballed in a hangar, maintained by skeleton crews, ready for reactivation when the political winds shifted. The production lines were shut down. The specialized tooling, the jigs, the welding fixtures, the calibration rigs, the custom forming dies was disassembled and in many cases scrapped. The factories that manufactured the phone engines, each one a masterwork of precision plumbing that channeled liquid oxygen and kerosene through thousands of individual injector orifices to produce 1.5 million pounds of thrust, were retooled for entirely different purposes or shuttered altogether. The contractors who built the Saturn V's major components received no continuation orders. North American Rockwell, which built the S-2 second stage, moved on to other defense contracts. Douglas Aircraft, which built the SVB third stage, was absorbed into McDonnell Douglas and eventually Boeing. The Michoud assembly facility in New Orleans, where the massive first stage tanks were welded together in a building so large it has its own weather patterns, was repurposed for space shuttle external tank production. The infrastructure physically existed, but its purpose, its configuration, its workforce, and its institutional purpose had been completely transformed. 3 unused Saturn V rockets survived. One lies on its side at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Another is displayed at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. A third is exhibited at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. They are magnificent artifacts, but artifacts is precisely the right word. They are objects preserved for historical contemplation, not operational use. You cannot fuel a museum exhibit. You cannot launch a display piece, and even if you could, a single rocket is not a space program. A space program is a living system of factories, supply chains, engineering teams, test facilities, launch infrastructure, and institutional knowledge that functions as an integrated whole. The rockets in those museums are organs removed from a body that no longer exists. The loss of the Saturn V, dramatic as it is, represents only the most visible layer of a far deeper destruction. The true devastation was not the loss of hardware, it was the loss of the human infrastructure that created the hardware. At its peak, the Apollo workforce spanned every state in the Union, employing 250,000 engineers and technicians supported by an even larger network of manufacturing and logistics personnel. These were not interchangeable labourers performing generic tasks. They were specialists. Welders who understood the specific metallurgical behaviour of the aluminium-copper alloys used in cryogenic fuel tanks at temperatures of -250 degrees Fahrenheit. Machinists who could hold tolerances of 10,000ths of an inch on turbopump components spinning at 6,000 revolutions per minute. Electrical engineers who designed harnesses containing miles of wiring that had to function flawlessly through the vibration, acoustic shock, and thermal extremes of launch. Systems engineers who understood how 10,000 subsystems from 200 different suppliers integrated into a single vehicle that had to work perfectly the first time, every time, with human lives at stake. When Apollo ended, these people did not enter cryogenic suspension. They moved on. The welders took jobs in shipyards and petrochemical plants. The machinists went to automotive and defense manufacturing. The electrical engineers joined the nascent computer industry. The systems engineers scattered across a dozen sectors. Within 5 years of the final lunar mission, the workforce that had made Apollo possible was dispersed across the American economy, its collective expertise diluted beyond recovery. Some of this expertise was documented. Blueprints existed, technical reports filled warehouses. Test data was archived on magnetic tape and microfilm. But anyone who has ever tried to build something complex from documentation alone understands the gap between what drawings show and what experienced hands know. A blueprint can specify a weld joint's geometry, the filler material, the current and voltage settings, and the shielding gas composition. What a blueprint cannot capture is the subtle technique an experienced welder uses to compensate for the way a particular alloy warps under thermal stress during a multipass cryogenic tank seam. That adjustment, a slight change in torch angle, a specific travel speed learned through years of repetition, a feel for when the puddle is behaving correctly, exists as tacit knowledge. It lives in muscle memory and professional intuition. It is transmitted not through documents but through apprenticeship, standing next to someone who has done it successfully 10,000 times and absorbing what cannot be written down. When the Apollo workforce dispersed, those chains of transmission broke. The masters left and took their mastery with them. The apprentices who might have carried the knowledge forward were never trained because there was no program to train them for. NASA discovered the depth of this loss decades later, and the discovery was jarring. In the 1990s, when engineers at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville attempted to reference Saturn V documentation for use in new rocket development efforts, they found an archive that was far less useful than anyone had assumed. Blueprints were incomplete. Manufacturing specifications referenced procedures identified only by internal codes that no living engineer could decipher. Assembly instructions contained notes like, "per standard shop practice," a phrase that was perfectly clear to the technicians of 1966 and perfectly opaque to anyone reading it 30 years later. The standard shop practice was gone. It had walked out the door with the people who practiced it. Some accounts describe this situation using the phrase, "we lost the technology." That formulation, while emotionally resonant and widely repeated, is slightly imprecise in a way that matters. The underlying physics did not change. Newton's laws still govern rocket propulsion. The thermodynamic principles of combustion chamber design remain understood. The fundamental engineering knowledge that enables rocket construction has not been forgotten. What was lost was something more specific and, in practical terms, more devastating. The industrial capability to produce the specific hardware. The supply chains that delivered exotic alloys in the required grades and quantities. The manufacturing processes refined through years of trial and error. The quality control procedures calibrated to the unique demands of human-rated spaceflight hardware. the integration expertise that allowed tens of thousands of components from hundreds of different sources to come together into a functioning vehicle, the institutional reflexes knowing which problems were serious and which were manageable, knowing when to stop testing and start building, knowing how to make the 1,000 small decisions per day that a complex development program demands. Rebuilding this capability is not a matter of pulling old drawings from a filing cabinet and handing them to a modern machine shop. It requires reconstituting an entire ecosystem of specialized production and doing so in an industrial environment that has transformed beyond recognition since the 1960s. Consider one small example. The injector plate for the phone engine contained roughly 2,600 individual fuel and oxidizer orifices, each one precision drilled and positioned to create a specific spray pattern that ensured stable combustion at chamber pressures approaching 1,000 pounds per square inch. The manufacturing process for this single component required specialized drilling equipment, custom fixtures, and a quality inspection regimen that took weeks to complete for each unit. The technicians who performed this work developed an intuitive understanding of how drill wear affected hole geometry, how fixture alignment drifted over production runs, and how to detect the subtle dimensional deviations that could lead to combustion instability. When engineers at NASA revisited phone documentation decades later as part of studies into next-generation engine development, they found that recreating the injector plate using modern manufacturing techniques was straightforward in principle but surprisingly difficult in practice. The old specifications assumed manufacturing methods that no longer existed. Modern CNC machining could achieve the required tolerances, but the process parameters had to be developed from scratch. The tacit knowledge about how the original injectors were validated, which test results were acceptable, which anomalies were tolerable, which patterns in test data indicated emerging problems, had to be reconstructed through expensive and time-consuming trial and error. Multiply this challenge across every major component of a heavy-lift launch vehicle, and you begin to appreciate the scale of what was lost. The Saturn V contained roughly 3 million individual parts. Each one was manufactured, inspected, and integrated by people whose expertise vanished with the program. Rebuilding the capability to produce even a fraction of these components requires investments of time, money, and human capital that dwarf the cost of the original development, because the original development benefited from a standing industrial base that no longer exists. The budget trajectory that followed Apollo's cancellation ensured that this rebuilding would not occur for decades. After the peak of the Apollo funding era, NASA's budget entered a decline that has never been reversed. By 1970, the year after the first moon landing, the agency's budget had already dropped significantly. By 1975, it had fallen to roughly 1% of federal spending. It has remained in the range of 0.5% to 1% ever since, fluctuating with political cycles but never approaching anything resembling Apollo-era investment. This funding level is not trivial. 1% of the federal budget still represents billions of dollars annually. But it is fundamentally insufficient to simultaneously maintain existing programs and develop new deep space capabilities. NASA has been forced, for 50 years, to make choices that Apollo-era leadership never confronted. Which priorities to fund and which to defer, which technologies to develop and which to abandon, which missions to fly and which to leave on paper. The space shuttle absorbed the consequences of this constrained budget more completely than any other program, and in doing so, it consumed the resources that might otherwise have sustained or rebuilt deep space capability. The shuttle was sold to Congress and the American public in the early 1970s as a revolution in space transportation. The pitch was seductive. A reusable spacecraft that would launch like a rocket, operate in orbit like a laboratory, and land like an aircraft. Flight rates of 40 to 50 missions per year. Per flight costs low enough to make space access routine. A vehicle so versatile it could serve military, scientific, and commercial customers simultaneously, while making the expensive, expendable rockets of the Apollo era obsolete. Almost none of these promises materialized. The shuttle flew a total of 135 missions across 30 years of operations, an average of roughly 4.5 flights per year, not 50. Each mission cost approximately $1.5 billion when all operational and infrastructure expenses were included. The turnaround time between flights stretched to months rather than the weeks originally projected. The vehicle required an army of technicians to inspect, refurbish, and recertify between each mission. Reusability, which was supposed to drive costs down, actually drove them up because of the extraordinary maintenance burden required to keep a vehicle flying safely after repeated exposure to the thermal and mechanical stresses of launch and re-entry. The shuttle was not a bad spacecraft. It was a genuinely remarkable engineering achievement in many respects. It could carry payloads of up to roughly 23 metric tons to low Earth orbit. It supported crews of up to 7 astronauts. It enabled the construction of the International Space Station by delivering modules and components that no other vehicle of the era could have carried. It deployed, serviced, and repaired the Hubble Space Telescope. It conducted hundreds of scientific experiments across disciplines ranging from materials science to human physiology. But the shuttle had a ceiling, and that ceiling was low Earth orbit. Maximum altitude was approximately 600 kilometers. The Moon is 384,000 kilometers away. The shuttle could no more reach the Moon than a harbour ferry could cross the Atlantic. Yet for 3 decades, this orbital vehicle consumed the overwhelming majority of NASA's human spaceflight budget workforce, facilities, engineering attention, institutional focus, and political capital. This is not primarily a criticism of the shuttle's design or the people who operated it. It is a structural observation about what happens when a single program monopolizes a constrained budget. Every dollar spent on shuttle operations was a dollar not spent on developing the next generation of deep space transportation. Every engineer assigned to shuttle maintenance was an engineer not working on heavy-lift launch vehicles, lunar landers, or deep space habitats. Every management decision oriented toward shuttle flight rates and safety was a decision that did not address the challenge of returning humans to the Moon. Consider what those 3 decades of constrained budgets actually prevented. During the 1980s and 90s, while shuttle operations consumed the lion's share of NASA's human spaceflight resources, an entire generation of deep space technologies went undeveloped. Lunar lander designs remained on paper. Closed-loop life support systems that could sustain crews for weeks or months beyond low Earth orbit received only modest laboratory research funding, rather than the flight development investment needed to produce operational hardware. Advanced spacesuit designs capable of handling the abrasive lunar dust environment progressed through conceptual studies but never reached the prototype stage. In situ resource utilization, the technology that could eventually allow astronauts to extract water and produce propellant from lunar regolith, existed only as a theoretical framework discussed at academic conferences. Deep space habitation modules, radiation-hardened power systems, autonomous surface rovers capable of operating in the lunar thermal environment, each of these represented a technology that would require a decade or more of dedicated development to bring to flight readiness. Each received intermittent study funding that produced reports and recommendations, but no flight hardware. The shuttle did not merely prevent NASA from flying to the Moon. It prevented the agency from developing the technologies that would have made a future lunar program faster, cheaper, and more technically mature when the political moment finally arrived. Every year that passed without sustained investment in these capabilities was a year added to the eventual timeline for returning to the lunar surface. The opportunity cost was staggering. Across 30 years of shuttle operations, NASA spent approximately $200 billion in inflation-adjusted terms on the program. That sum is comparable to the entire cost of the Apollo program, except Apollo produced a capability to reach the Moon, while the shuttle produced a capability to reach an altitude 1,000th of the way there. The International Space Station extended and deepened this pattern. Station construction began with the first module launch in 1998, and consumed enormous resources over the following decade. The station is a genuine marvel of international engineering cooperation. It has provided an unbroken platform for scientific research in orbit for over 2 decades, generating invaluable data on the effects of long-duration microgravity on the human body. It has generated invaluable data on the effects of long-duration microgravity on the human body, data that will be essential for any future deep space mission, including lunar return. But like the shuttle that built it, the station exists in low Earth orbit. And like the shuttle, it absorbed budget, engineering capacity, and institutional attention that might otherwise have been directed toward deep space capability. For roughly 2 decades, NASA's human spaceflight program was defined almost entirely by 2 objectives: operating the shuttle and building and maintaining the station. Both were worthy endeavors. Neither moved humanity 1 kilometer closer to the moon. The combined effect of shuttle and station dominance was a half-century gap in deep space human exploration capability. When the last Apollo crew departed the lunar surface in December 1972, the United States possessed operational hardware capable of delivering humans to the moon. By the time the shuttle retired in July 2011, that capability had been absent for nearly 4 decades, and the industrial base required to recreate it had been completely transformed. Several attempts were made to break this cycle, and understanding why they failed reveals the structural nature of the problem. In 1989, on the 20th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing, President George H.W. Bush announced the Space Exploration Initiative. Standing on the steps of the National Air and Space Museum, he called for a permanent return to the moon and eventual human missions to Mars. NASA responded with a study called the 90-Day Report, which outlined an architecture requiring an estimated $500 billion over 20 to 30 years. Congress recoiled at the price tag. The initiative was functionally dead within 2 years, killed not by technical impossibility but by fiscal unwillingness. In 2004, President George W. Bush announced the vision for space exploration, which called for completing the International Space Station, retiring the shuttle, developing new crew and cargo vehicles, and returning astronauts to the moon by 2020. The resulting Constellation program produced early designs for the Ares 1 crew launch vehicle, the Ares V heavy-lift cargo launcher, the Orion crew capsule, and the Altair lunar lander. Real engineering work was performed, metal was cut, tests were conducted, progress was made, but the program was chronically underfunded relative to its ambitions. Schedule slipped, costs grew. The Augustine Commission, convened by President Obama in 2009 to evaluate NASA's human spaceflight plans, concluded that Constellation's goals were not executable under projected budget profiles. The committee found that without significant budget increases that neither the administration nor Congress was willing to provide, the program could not achieve lunar landing within any reasonable time frame. In 2010, President Obama cancelled Constellation. The Ares I and Altair lander were terminated. The Ares V evolved into what eventually became the Space Launch System. The Orion capsule survived and continues development to this day as part of the Artemis architecture, but billions of dollars in development work on cancelled systems yielded no operational hardware. Engineers who had spent years designing Constellation-specific components watched their work archived rather than flown. The human cost of this cancellation extended far beyond wasted budgets. Engineers who had uprooted their families to relocate to Huntsville or Houston or the Cape for the promise of building the next generation of deep space vehicles found themselves reassigned to programs with uncertain futures, or laid off entirely. Mid-career specialists who had invested 5 or 6 years developing expertise in Constellation-specific systems, the Altair lander's throttleable descent engine, the Ares V's Earth departure stage, the surface habitat thermal protection architecture, discovered that their skills had no immediate application elsewhere. Some transitioned to the nascent commercial space sector. Others left aerospace entirely. taking with them precisely the kind of deep space engineering experience that would be desperately needed when the next lunar program inevitably appeared. The institutional damage compounded with each cycle. By the time Artemis was announced, a generation of aerospace professionals had been shaped entirely by programs that started and stopped. Their formative career experiences were not of building and flying hardware, but of designing systems that were cancelled before they reached the launch pad. This bred a specific kind of institutional caution, a reluctance to commit fully to any program's long-term vision, because experience had taught that the vision would change with the next administration. Recruiting young engineers became harder when the most honest answer to the question, "Will this program still exist in 10 years?" was an uncomfortable silence. In 2017, the Trump administration signed Space Policy Directive 1, redirecting NASA toward the Moon. By 2019, the timeline had been accelerated to target a crewed landing by 2024. The Artemis program was formally established, building on the surviving elements of Constellation, primarily Orion and SLS, while adding new components including the Lunar Gateway and commercially developed human landing systems. The program represented the most concrete and well-funded attempt at lunar return since Apollo itself. But even Artemis has struggled with the structural forces that defeated its predecessors. The Space Launch System, while technically impressive, has experienced persistent cost growth and schedule delays. Its per-flight cost, estimated at over $4 billion for early missions by NASA's own Inspector General, has drawn criticism from advocates of commercial alternatives. The human landing system development, contracted to SpaceX and later also to Blue Origin, depends on technologies, particularly orbital refueling at scale, that have never been demonstrated operationally. Timelines have slipped repeatedly. The original 2024 landing target was pushed to 2025, then 2026, and may shift further. Each of these programs, the Space Exploration Initiative, Constellation, and to some extent Artemis, confronted the same fundamental obstacle. Not engineering impossibility, but the mismatch between the timescales of space hardware development and the timescales of political commitment. Developing a new human-rated launch vehicle from concept to operational flight takes approximately 10 to 15 years under favorable conditions. Developing a lunar lander, a deep space habitat, and the associated ground infrastructure adds further years. A realistic timeline for establishing sustained lunar surface capability, starting from the post-shuttle baseline, spans decades rather than years. No American president serves more than 8 years. Congressional priorities shift with every election cycle. The budget process operates on annual timelines with limited forward commitment. A program that requires decades of consistent investment must survive multiple changes in administration, each of which brings new priorities, new advisors, and new political calculations about how to allocate scarce resources. The result has been a cycle of initiation and cancellation that has consumed tens of billions of dollars while producing remarkably little operational deep space capability. Each new administration announces bold goals. Each funds a program that makes genuine but incomplete progress. Each successor reviews the inherited program, finds it too expensive, too slow, or misaligned with their own priorities, and restructures or cancels it. Engineers who devoted years to one architecture watch it dissolved and are asked to begin again on a new one. Industrial partners who invested in specific technologies find their contracts terminated and their production lines idled. Institutional knowledge that accumulated during one program's development is partially lost during the transition to the next. This is not merely inefficient, it is actively destructive. Each cancellation does not merely fail to advance the goal. It sets the effort back by dispersing teams, wasting invested capital, and eroding the confidence of the workforce and industrial base that any future program will survive long enough to reach completion. The aerospace industry has learned to treat lunar return announcements with a specific kind of weary skepticism. Engineers who joined NASA or its contractors in the early 2000s to work on Constellation watched that program cancelled. Some of those same engineers were reassigned to SLS and Orion development. only to see timelines stretch and budgets tighten. Younger engineers entering the field today have no institutional memory of a time when deep space human exploration programs ran to completion. Their entire professional experience has been shaped by programs that start, struggle, and stop. This workforce erosion may be the most damaging long-term consequence of the post-Apollo decades. Rockets can be designed on paper relatively quickly. Factories can be built in a few years. But developing a workforce with the skills, experience, and institutional confidence to execute a program as complex as lunar return takes a generation. That generation must be recruited, trained, retained through the inevitable difficulties of development, and given the opportunity to build and fly hardware, not just design it, but see it through to operation. The start-stop cycle denies them that opportunity, and in doing so, it undermines the foundation on which any future program must be built. The cumulative picture, 53 years after the last human footprint was pressed into the lunar dust, is sobering. The rockets are gone, the factories are repurposed, the workforce is dispersed. The institutional knowledge is fragmented. The budget is a fraction of what Apollo required. Multiple attempts at rebuilding deep space capability have been initiated and abandoned, each one consuming resources while leaving behind only partial progress. The modern effort to return humans to the moon does not begin from where Apollo left off. It begins from a position that is in many practical respects more challenging than where Apollo started, because Apollo began with a clean sheet and a blank check, while Artemis must navigate the accumulated technical debt, political baggage, and institutional scar tissue of 5 decades of false starts. The contrast between Apollo's industrial environment and today's extends even to the basic mechanics of procurement and manufacturing. In the 1960s, NASA could direct contracts to specific companies with relatively streamlined competitive processes. The agency could mandate domestic sourcing for virtually every component, ensuring that supply chains remained within national borders and under direct governmental oversight. Manufacturing facilities were often purpose-built with federal dollars specifically for Apollo hardware, meaning the agency effectively controlled the means of production. Modern aerospace procurement operates through layers of regulatory compliance, competitive bidding requirements, intellectual property negotiations, and international trade considerations that add years and significant cost to every major contract. Supply chains are globalized. A single rocket engine may contain alloys sourced from 3 continents, electronic components fabricated in multiple countries, and software developed by teams spanning half a dozen time zones. Managing this complexity is achievable, but it imposes overhead costs and schedule risks that Apollo's domestically contained industrial base simply never faced. The industrial machine that sent humans to the moon was not mothballed. It was not preserved for future generations. It was taken apart, piece by piece, person by person, decision by decision, until nothing remained but museum displays and fading documentation. Rebuilding that machine, or rather, building an entirely new one suited to modern requirements, is the central challenge of the current era. And that challenge is made enormously harder by a fact that most people find counterintuitive. The mission itself, the actual task of putting humans on the moon and keeping them alive, is far more demanding now than it was in 1969. Not because the moon has changed, but because everything we require of the mission has changed beyond recognition. That transformation is where the story turns next. There is a deeply intuitive assumption that shapes how most people think about technological progress. The assumption goes something like this: if we could do something 50 years ago with primitive technology, we should be able to do it better, faster, and cheaper today. With modern tools, we carry supercomputers in our pockets that contain more processing power than every machine used in the entire Apollo program combined. We have materials science that the 1960s could not have imagined. We have manufacturing precision, computational modeling, communication bandwidth, and simulation capability that would have seemed like science fiction to the engineers who designed the Saturn V. Surely, with all of this, landing on the moon should be easier now than it was then. This reasoning feels airtight. it is also completely wrong. Not because the technological advantages are illusory, they are real and they matter, but because they are being applied to a fundamentally different problem. The mission that Apollo was designed to accomplish, and the mission that modern lunar programs must accomplish, share a destination. They share almost nothing else. Understanding this distinction is essential to understanding why returning to the moon has taken so long, and why the engineering challenge is, in many critical respects, harder today than it was in 1969. The difficulty does not come from the moon itself. The moon has not changed. The difficulty comes from us, from what we now demand of any mission that carries human beings beyond low Earth orbit. Start with the most basic architectural difference, because it governs everything that follows. Apollo was designed around a single concept: minimum time on target. Get to the surface, perform activities, get off the surface, come home. The entire mission profile was engineered to minimize the duration of exposure to every hazard the moon presents. Crews spent between 21 hours and 75 hours on the lunar surface across the 6 landing missions. The longest stay, Apollo 17, lasted just over 3 days. Transit time from Earth to lunar orbit was approximately 3 days each way. Total mission duration from launch to splashdown ranged from 8 to 12 days. Every system aboard the spacecraft was sized for that timeline and not a minute longer. Oxygen supplies, water reserves, food stores, carbon dioxide scrubbing capacity, battery power, thermal management, each was calculated against the expected mission duration, plus a modest contingency margin. There was no excess. There was no provision for extending the stay if something interesting was discovered. There was no capability to wait out an emergency that lasted longer than the built-in reserves could sustain. This was not poor planning. It was ruthless optimization. Every kilogram of additional consumables meant a kilogram less of something else. Scientific instruments, fuel reserves, structural margin. The lunar module was so mass-constrained that its cabin walls measured barely 1/3 of a millimeter thick, in some sections thin enough that an engineer pressing too hard with a tool during assembly could risk puncturing the Trenefirst pressure vessel. The vehicle was engineered to the razor edge of what was physically necessary because every gram counted, and the mission was designed to need as few grams as possible. Modern lunar programs cannot operate this way. The objectives have fundamentally changed. Artemis and its international counterparts are not designed to plant flags and collect samples during brief visits. They are designed to establish sustained human presence missions lasting weeks initially, then months, then eventually permanent habitation with rotating crews. The architectural requirements for this kind of presence are categorically different from what Apollo demanded, and the differences compound across every system and subsystem on the vehicle and on the surface. Consider life support, because it illustrates the scaling problem with particular clarity. Apollo used what engineers call open-loop life support systems. Oxygen was stored in high-pressure tanks and released into the cabin as needed. Carbon dioxide exhaled by the crew was removed by passing cabin air through lithium hydroxide canisters, chemical sponges that absorbed carbon dioxide through an irreversible reaction. Once a canister was saturated, it was discarded and replaced with a fresh one. Water was generated as a byproduct of the hydrogen-oxygen fuel cells that produced electricity. Food was carried in pre-packaged form. Waste was collected and stored. This approach works elegantly for short missions. The consumable mass scales linearly with crew size and duration. 2 astronauts for 3 days requires a specific quantity of oxygen, lithium hydroxide canisters, water, and food. The numbers are manageable. The systems are simple. Failure modes are well understood. The entire life support architecture for an Apollo lunar module surface stay weighed a few hundred kilograms. Now extend that same open-loop approach to a mission lasting 28 days with a crew of 4. Oxygen requirements increase roughly 19-fold. Lithium hydroxide canister requirements increase by the same factor. Water consumption not just for drinking but for food preparation, equipment cooling, and hygiene scales proportionally. Food mass increases. Waste storage volume increases. The total consumable mass for a 4-week surface mission using Apollo-style open-loop life support would exceed the entire payload capacity of the lunar module by a significant margin. You cannot carry enough supplies to sustain a crew for a month using systems designed for a 3-day camping trip. The solution is partially or fully closed-loop life support systems that recycle air and water rather than consuming and discarding them. The International Space Station has operated such systems for over 2 decades, and they work. The station's water recovery system processes humidity, condensate, and urine into potable water, with recent upgrades including a brine processor assembly, pushing recovery efficiency to approximately 98%. The oxygen generation system electrolyzes water to produce breathable oxygen. The carbon dioxide removal assembly uses regenerable beds that can be reused thousands of times rather than disposable canisters. These systems dramatically reduce the consumable mass that must be launched from Earth. Instead of carrying all the water a crew will need for an entire mission, you carry a modest initial supply and recycle it continuously. Instead of packing hundreds of lithium hydroxide canisters, you install a regenerable system that processes carbon dioxide indefinitely with only periodic maintenance. But closed-loop life support introduces complexity that open-loop systems avoid entirely. The water recovery system on the International Space Station is a sophisticated piece of chemical engineering involving distillation, filtration, catalytic oxidation, and ion exchange processes. It requires regular maintenance, replacement of filters and catalytic beds, and monitoring by trained crew members. It has experienced failures, pumps seizing, contamination events, sensor malfunctions that required troubleshooting and repair. On the station, these failures are manageable because resupply vehicles can deliver spare parts within weeks, and the crew can survive on stored reserves while repairs are made. On the lunar surface, the calculus changes. Resupply from Earth requires a dedicated launch, transit, and landing, a process measured in weeks to months, not days. Spare parts must either be carried along in advance, adding mass, or manufactured on site using capabilities that do not yet exist. A life support failure that would be a minor inconvenience on the station becomes a potential mission-ending emergency on the Moon. This drives requirements for redundancy backup systems, spare components, alternative operating modes that add further mass, complexity, and cost. Adapting station-derived life support technology for the lunar environment introduces additional challenges that have no analogue in low Earth orbit. Lunar gravity is roughly 1/6 of Earth's. Fluid systems that rely on gravity-driven separation, which includes many water recovery processes, must be redesigned for reduced gravity conditions. Lunar dust, which infiltrates virtually every system it contacts, poses contamination risks to filters, seals, and fluid handling components. The thermal environment on the lunar surface, which swings from roughly 120 degrees Celsius in sunlight to -170 in shadow, imposes thermal management demands that the station's controlled orbital environment does not experience. None of these problems are unsolvable. Engineers have proposed and in some cases prototyped solutions for each of them, but each solution requires development, testing, qualification, and integration processes that consume years and billions of dollars. The life support systems for sustained lunar presence represent not a minor upgrade from Apollo, but an entirely different technological generation, more closely related to what will eventually be needed for Mars missions than to anything that flew during the 1960s. Radiation protection presents an equally stark contrast between the Apollo approach and modern requirements, and the difference is governed entirely by time. The Moon has no global magnetic field. It has essentially no atmosphere. Its surface is exposed, without meaningful shielding, to the full spectrum of space radiation. This includes galactic cosmic rays, high-energy particles originating from supernovae, and other violent astrophysical events throughout the galaxy and solar particle events, intense bursts of energetic protons ejected by the Sun during coronal mass ejections and solar flares. Galactic cosmic rays deliver a slow, continuous dose of radiation that accumulates over time. Individual particles are extraordinarily energetic. Some carry the kinetic energy of a professionally pitched baseball concentrated into a single atomic nucleus. These particles penetrate conventional shielding materials, and some actually produce secondary radiation showers when they strike shielding, potentially increasing the dose to crew members behind thin shields rather than reducing it. Effective shielding against galactic cosmic rays requires substantial mass meters of regolith, or thick layers of hydrogen-rich materials like polyethylene or water. Solar particle events are different in character, but potentially more dangerous in the short term. A major solar event can deliver in a matter of hours a radiation dose that would normally accumulate over months of galactic cosmic ray exposure. The intensity is unpredictable. Events can occur with little warning, sometimes as little as 15 to 30 minutes between the first observable signs on the Sun and the arrival of energetic particles at the Moon's distance. The duration can range from hours to days. The most severe events on record would deliver doses capable of causing acute radiation sickness, nausea, immune suppression, and potentially death to unshielded astronauts on the lunar surface. Apollo crews were exposed to all of these hazards. They survived because their missions were short and because they were fortunate. None of the Apollo surface missions coincided with a major solar particle event. This was not guaranteed. Solar activity during the Apollo era was moderate, but significant events occurred between missions. A major proton event in August 1972 fell between the Apollo 16 and 17 missions. Had it coincided with a surface stay, the crew would have received a dose estimated at several hundred millisieverts in a matter of hours, enough to cause acute symptoms and significantly increase lifetime cancer risk. Whether it would have been lethal is debated, but it would certainly have constituted a medical emergency, with no treatment available on the lunar surface. For a 3-day visit, accepting this risk was a calculated gamble consistent with Apollo's overall approach to crew safety. The probability of a major event occurring during any specific 72-hour window is relatively low. Across a small number of missions, the cumulative probability remains manageable if you are willing to accept the consequences should the gamble fail. For missions lasting weeks or months, the calculation changes entirely. Galactic cosmic ray exposure accumulates linearly with time. A 30-day surface stay delivers roughly 10 times the galactic cosmic ray dose of a 3-day stay. Over months, the accumulated dose approaches or exceeds career limits established by modern spaceflight medical standards. And the probability of encountering at least one significant solar particle event during an extended surface mission increases substantially. For a mission spanning a full lunar day-night cycle of 29.5 Earth days, the probability is no longer a minor risk factor. It becomes a near certainty over multiple mission rotations. Modern mission architectures must therefore incorporate radiation protection as a fundamental design requirement rather than an accepted gamble. This means surface habitats with shielding sufficient to reduce galactic cosmic ray exposure to acceptable levels, likely involving regolith piled over habitat modules to a depth of several meters, or construction within lava tubes that provide natural overhead shielding. It means dedicated storm shelters within every pressurized volume, capable of protecting crews during solar particle events with sufficient provisions for stays of 24 to 72 hours. It means real-time radiation monitoring and early warning systems linked to solar observation networks. Each of these requirements adds mass, cost, and complexity to the surface architecture. A habitat designed to be buried under regolith must be structurally robust enough to support the overburden. A storm shelter must be accessible from every working location on the surface within the warning time available. Monitoring systems must be reliable and redundant. None of this existed in the Apollo architecture because none of it was needed for a 3-day sprint. The thermal environment of the lunar surface introduces engineering demands that Apollo avoided through careful scheduling, but that sustained presence cannot escape. The Moon rotates once every 29.5 Earth days. This means approximately 14 days of continuous sunlight, followed by 14 days of continuous darkness at most locations. During the sunlit period, surface temperatures at equatorial latitudes reach approximately 120 degrees Celsius. During the lunar night, temperatures plunge to approximately minus 170 degrees Celsius. The transition is not gradual. Because the moon lacks an atmosphere to retain or distribute heat, temperatures swing rapidly as the sun rises or sets on the local horizon. Apollo missions landed during lunar morning at carefully selected equatorial sites, ensuring moderate thermal conditions throughout the surface stay. Crews were never on the surface long enough for the thermal environment to shift significantly. The lunar module's thermal control system was designed for a narrow temperature range and a short operational period. It did not need to handle the extremes of the full day-night cycle because it was never exposed to them. A sustained presence must operate through both extremes. Equipment must function at temperatures that would freeze carbon dioxide solid during the night and approach the boiling point of water during the day. Materials expand and contract through thermal cycles that stress joints, seals, and structural connections. Electronics must be either actively heated during the night or designed to survive repeated deep cold cycles without degradation. Lubricants in mechanical systems must function across a temperature range of nearly 300 degrees Celsius. Power generation is the most immediately consequential thermal challenge. Solar arrays produce abundant electricity during the 14-day sunlit period, but generate nothing during the equally long night. For a sustained outpost, this means either storing enough energy during the day to sustain all operations through 2 weeks of darkness, requiring battery capacity orders of magnitude beyond current technology, or deploying nuclear power sources that operate independently of solar illumination. NASA and the Department of Energy have been developing fission power systems for the lunar surface, beginning with the kilopower technology demonstration and evolving into the Fission Surface Power Project, which targets approximately 40 kilowatts of continuous electrical power per unit. This is a meaningful start, but a sustained outpost with life support, thermal management, science operations, and in-situ resource processing will require substantially more power. Multiple units would be needed, along with the infrastructure to deploy, connect, and maintain them. Artemis has partially addressed the thermal and power challenge by focusing initial landing sites near the lunar South Pole. Certain elevated locations near the South Pole receive near-continuous sunlight due to the moon's slight axial tilt, just 1.5 degrees from the ecliptic plane. These so-called peaks of eternal light offer dramatically better thermal and power conditions than equatorial sites. Solar arrays positioned on these elevations could generate power nearly continuously, with only brief shadow periods. But even these favourable locations sit adjacent to some of the most extreme thermal environments in the solar system. The permanently shadowed craters near the lunar pole's regions that have not seen sunlight in billions of years harbour temperatures as low as minus 230 degrees Celsius, colder than the surface of Pluto. These craters are scientifically and operationally critical because they are believed to contain deposits of water ice accumulated over geological time from comet impacts and solar wind implantation. This water ice represents possibly the single most strategically important resource for sustained lunar presence. If it can be extracted and processed, it yields drinking water, breathable oxygen through electrolysis, and most transformatively, hydrogen and oxygen that can be used as rocket propellant. The concept is called in situ resource utilization, and it sits at the center of every serious long-term lunar architecture. The ability to produce propellant on the moon, rather than launching it from Earth at enormous cost, would fundamentally alter the economics of deep space exploration, turning the moon from a destination into a supply depot. But extracting water ice from permanently shadowed craters at 230 degrees below 0 Celsius requires an entirely new category of surface operations hardware. Mining equipment must function in permanent darkness at temperatures that would shatter most conventional materials. Excavated regolith-containing ice must be transported to processing facilities where heat is applied to sublimate the ice, converting it directly from solid to vapor, which is then captured, purified, and either stored or further processed into hydrogen and oxygen through electrolysis. The processing plants require significant power. Storage systems must prevent the processed water and gases from refreezing or escaping. Transportation systems must operate reliably across the boundary between sunlit areas and permanently shadowed regions, enduring temperature differentials of hundreds of degrees within short distances. The decision to focus Artemis landings at the lunar South Pole is often presented in public communications as a scientific preference. The poles are interesting because they contain water ice and offer unique geological research. Opportunities. This framing, while accurate, understates the architectural necessity behind the choice. The South Pole is not merely the most scientifically attractive destination. For sustained human presence, it may be the only viable one given current technology constraints. An equatorial outpost, similar to the Apollo landing sites, would face the full 14-day lunar night with no sunlight for power generation and temperatures plunging to minus 170 degrees Celsius. Surviving that 2-week darkness with current battery technology would require energy storage systems so massive that their launch cost alone would consume a significant fraction of the program budget. Nuclear power systems capable of bridging the gap remain in early development and are years from flight readiness at the required power levels. The South Polar Peaks resolve this problem through orbital geometry rather than technological brute force. The Moon's minimal axial tilt means that elevated terrain near the poles can remain in near-continuous sunlight as the Moon orbits the Sun, receiving illumination for roughly 90% of the lunar year at the most favourable locations. This transforms power generation from an unsolved crisis into a manageable engineering problem. Solar arrays on polar peaks can sustain operations with only modest battery reserves for brief shadow periods, rather than the enormous storage systems an equatorial site would demand. None of this technology exists as flight-qualified hardware. Individual components have been prototyped and tested in laboratory settings and in simulated lunar environments. Robotic precursor missions planned under NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services program aim to characterize ice deposits and test extraction concepts. But the gap between laboratory demonstration and operational resource extraction at the scale needed to support a permanent outpost remains vast. Bridging that gap will require years of iterative development, field testing, and system integration. Lunar regolith itself presents a hazard that Apollo encountered but never had to manage over extended periods. The lunar surface is covered in a layer of fine, angular particles created by billions of years of micrometeorite bombardment. Unlike terrestrial sand, which is rounded and smoothed by wind and water erosion, lunar regolith particles are jagged shards of glass and mineral with sharp edges that never wear down. These particles carry persistent electrostatic charges generated by solar ultraviolet radiation and the solar wind, causing them to cling tenaciously to virtually any surface they contact. Apollo astronauts reported significant problems with lunar dust after even brief surface excursions. Regolith infiltrated suit joints and degraded their mobility. It scratched helmet visors, reducing visibility. It coated optical instruments and thermal control surfaces. When tracked into the lunar module cabin, it irritated astronauts' eyes and respiratory systems. Harrison Schmitt, the geologist on Apollo 17, reported symptoms resembling hay fever after exposure to cabin dust, describing congestion and irritation that persisted for hours. For 3-day missions, these effects were tolerable inconveniences. For sustained operations, they become serious engineering and health concerns. Abrasive regolith particles accelerate wear on mechanical seals, bearings, and moving components. Dust accumulation on solar arrays reduces power generation efficiency. Contamination of life support system filters and fluid handling components degrades performance and increases maintenance requirements. Long-term inhalation of fine regolith particles, which contain a significant fraction of nanoscale silicate shards, poses respiratory health risks that some researchers have compared to those associated with terrestrial silicosis and asbestosis. Managing dust contamination for extended surface operations requires systems that Apollo did not carry and did not need. airlock designs that minimize the transfer of regolith from the exterior to the habitat interior, suit cleaning or suit port systems that allow astronauts to enter and exit suits without bringing them inside the pressurized volume, dust-resistant coatings and materials for exposed equipment, filtration systems capable of removing fine particles from cabin air continuously over months of operation, monitoring protocols for crew respiratory health. Each of these represents an engineering challenge that must be solved, tested, and integrated before long-duration surface missions can be conducted safely. The aggregate effect of all these requirements, closed-loop life support, radiation shielding, thermal management across the full day-night cycle, continuous power generation, in-situ resource utilization, and dust mitigation, transforms the engineering problem from what Apollo faced into something almost unrecognizable. Apollo needed a vehicle that could keep 2 people alive for 3 days in a benign thermal window with no requirement for resource extraction, minimal radiation concern, and expendable systems throughout. Modern lunar programs need a surface architecture that can keep 4 or more people alive and productive for weeks to months across extreme thermal cycles, with closed-loop environmental systems, robust radiation protection, independent power generation, and the beginnings of local resource production. The comparison to Apollo is not a matter of degree. It is a difference in kind. Asking why Artemis takes longer than Apollo is like asking why building a year-round Antarctic research station takes longer than a weekend camping trip to the same continent. The destination is identical. Everything else about the undertaking is different. This is also why the Artemis architecture looks so different from Apollo's relatively simple 3-vehicle stack. Artemis involves the Space Launch System for Earth-to-orbit heavy lift, the Orion capsule for crew transit to and from lunar vicinity, the Gateway, a small space station in lunar orbit, as a staging and logistics platform, a human landing system, developed commercially by SpaceX and separately by Blue Origin, for transport between lunar orbit and the surface, habitats, power systems, rovers, and eventually resource extraction equipment, communication relay satellites for continuous surface-to-Earth contact, robotic precursor missions to characterize landing sites and test technologies. Each element addresses a genuine requirement that Apollo either did not face or deliberately chose to ignore. The Gateway provides a persistent platform in lunar orbit that can support multiple landing missions without requiring a full Earth-to-Moon transit for every crew rotation. The commercial landing systems introduce competitive development and cost-sharing structures. The surface systems, habitats, power, rovers enable the extended stays that Apollo's architecture could not support. The human landing system deserves particular attention because it represents the single largest source of both transformative potential and program risk in the entire Artemis architecture. SpaceX's Starship, selected as the landing vehicle for the initial Artemis crewed surface missions, is a spacecraft that bears almost no resemblance to the Apollo lunar module it conceptually replaces. The lunar module stood approximately 6.5 meters tall, with landing gear deployed and weighed roughly 15 metric tons fully fueled. Starship stands approximately 50 meters tall and weighs over 100 metric tons dry. The scale difference is not incremental, it is an order of magnitude. This scale enables capabilities that Apollo could never have contemplated. Starship's payload volume could carry habitation equipment, scientific instruments, rovers, and supplies sufficient to support surface stays measured in weeks rather than hours. Its cargo capacity transforms the logistics of lunar surface operations from the backpacking model of Apollo, where every gram was agonized over, to something closer to a proper expedition with meaningful infrastructure, delivered on each landing. But this scale introduces a dependency that has no precedent in the history of human spaceflight: orbital refueling. Starship cannot reach the lunar surface on a single launch from Earth. The vehicle must first reach low Earth orbit, then receive multiple deliveries of cryogenic propellant from tanker variants of the same vehicle launched separately. Current estimates suggest that each lunar mission may require somewhere between 6 and 16 tanker flights to fully fuel a single lunar Starship, depending on final vehicle performance and propellant boil-off rates during the fueling process. Orbital transfer of cryogenic propellants, supercooled liquid oxygen and liquid methane has never been demonstrated at this scale. The technical challenges include managing propellant boil-off in the thermal environment of low Earth orbit, achieving reliable fluid transfer between two vehicles in microgravity, maintaining propellant quality across multiple sequential transfers, and coordinating a rapid sequence of tanker launches within a window constrained by orbital mechanics and boil-off timelines. Each of these challenges is solvable in principle. None has been validated in practice at operational scale, but each element also adds interfaces, integration challenges, development risk, and schedule dependency. The Artemis architecture is more complex than Apollo, not because its designers were less elegant, but because the problem is more complex. You cannot build a permanent outpost with a 3-vehicle stack optimized for a 3-day visit. The added complexity is not bureaucratic bloat, it is engineering reality. The timeline implications are significant. Apollo moved from Kennedy's speech to the first lunar landing in 8 years, a pace that reflected unlimited budgets, wartime urgency, and extraordinary risk tolerance. Artemis, operating under constrained budgets, modern safety requirements, and the need to develop technologies that Apollo never attempted, will take longer. Not because the engineers are less capable. Modern aerospace engineers are working with tools and knowledge their Apollo predecessors could not have imagined, but because the problem they are solving is categorically more demanding. The temptation to compare timelines directly to ask why we cannot do in 8 years what Apollo did in 8 years ignores everything that has changed about the mission requirements, the safety standards, the budget environment, and the industrial base. It is a comparison between a sprint and a construction project. Sprints are faster. Construction projects produce something that lasts. What Artemis is attempting has no historical precedent. Apollo was a magnificent achievement, with clear historical parallels to other crash programs. The Manhattan Project, the mobilization of wartime industry. Sustained lunar presence has no parallel. No nation has ever established permanent habitation on a body other than Earth. The International Space Station is the closest analogue, but it operates in the comparatively benign environment of low Earth orbit with regular resupply access and the option of emergency crew return within hours. The Moon offers none of those advantages. It is 3 days from Earth. Resupply requires dedicated launches planned months in advance. Emergency return requires a functional ascent vehicle, a waiting orbital spacecraft, and a transit duration that makes rapid medical evacuation impossible. Every system must work, or the crew must have the means to survive until it can be repaired. The margin for error narrows dramatically compared to orbital operations, even as the environment grows substantially more hostile. This is the reality that separates modern lunar ambitions from Apollo's achievement. The destination is 384,000 kilometers away, the same distance it has always been. But the journey measured not in kilometers, but in the complexity of what must be built, tested, qualified, launched, assembled, and sustained is orders of magnitude longer than anything Apollo attempted. The Moon is not harder to reach than it was in 1969. It is harder to stay on, and staying is the entire point of going back. A 7th set of boot prints in the regolith, however symbolically powerful, would not justify the investment. What justifies the investment is infrastructure that endures systems that generate power through the lunar night, extract water from ancient ice, shelter crews from radiation, and transform the Moon from a place we visit into a place we use. Building that infrastructure is the actual mission, and it requires something that no engineering marvel can substitute for: sustained commitment across decades, stable funding through political transitions, and the institutional patience to solve problems that do not yield to urgency alone. Whether those conditions can be created and maintained is not an engineering question. It is a political one, and it is the question on which everything else depends. Everything explored so far converges on a single uncomfortable truth that most space enthusiasts would rather not confront. The primary barrier between humanity and a permanent return to the moon is not technical. It is institutional. Engineers know how to solve the thermal problem, the radiation problem, the life support problem, the dust problem, the power problem. They have proposed credible architectures, built working prototypes, and validated subsystem designs through testing and simulation. The engineering is extraordinarily difficult, but difficulty is what engineers exist to overcome. Given sufficient time, stable resources, and clear direction, they will solve every technical challenge the moon presents. The question that actually determines whether humans return to the lunar surface and stay there is different. It is a question about politics, money, patience, and the peculiar inability of democratic societies to sustain commitments that outlast individual election cycles. It is a question about whether the species that built the pyramids over decades and the great cathedrals over centuries can muster the same generational persistence for a project whose payoff is measured not in years, but in lifetimes. This is where the story of lunar return becomes fundamentally unlike the story of Apollo. Apollo required solving a technical problem under conditions of extraordinary political urgency. Modern lunar return requires solving a political problem under conditions of ordinary democratic governance. The second challenge is, in many ways, harder than the first. Begin with the structural mismatch that has defeated every post-Apollo attempt at lunar return, because it is the single most important factor in this entire narrative and the one least discussed in popular accounts. Developing a human-rated deep space transportation system from initial concept to operational flight takes between 10 and 15 years under favourable conditions. This is not a pessimistic estimate. It is the observed historical reality across multiple programs and multiple nations. The Space Shuttle took approximately 9 years from program approval to first flight. The International Space Station took over a decade from initial agreement to first module launch. The Space Launch System, building substantially on heritage hardware from the shuttle program, took over 12 years from formal authorization to first flight. The Orion capsule has been in development for nearly 2 decades. These timelines are not the product of incompetence or bureaucratic waste, though both exist in varying degrees in any large organization. They reflect the genuine complexity of designing, building, testing, and qualifying systems that must function with extreme reliability in environments that destroy most human-made objects. Human spaceflight hardware must survive launch vibration intense enough to shake apart conventional structures. It must operate in hard vacuum. It must manage thermal extremes that span hundreds of degrees. It must protect crew members against radiation, micrometeorites, and the slow degradation of every seal, bearing, and fluid system over extended operational lifetimes. Certifying that hardware meets these requirements involves testing campaigns that cannot be meaningfully compressed without accepting risks that modern safety standards prohibit. A realistic timeline for establishing sustained lunar surface capability, not a single landing, but an operational outpost, with habitats, power systems, surface transportation, and the beginnings of resource utilization spans 20 to 30 years from program initiation to mature operations. This is not a projection based on pessimism. It is a projection based on the observed pace of every comparable infrastructure program in the history of spaceflight. Now consider the political timeline against which this technical timeline must operate. An American president serves a maximum of 8 years. Congressional terms run 2 years for the House and 6 for the Senate. Federal budgets are authorized and appropriated annually, with limited mechanisms for binding future Congresses to multi-year commitments. Each new administration arrives with its own space policy priorities, its own appointed NASA administrator, its own relationship with congressional committees, and its own political calculus about how to allocate discretionary spending. The arithmetic is unforgiving. A program that requires 25 years of sustained investment must survive at least 3 and possibly 4 changes of presidential administration. It must maintain support through 6 or 7 congressional election cycles. It must weather economic recessions, competing national priorities, shifting geopolitical conditions, and the inevitable technical setbacks that accompany any complex development effort. It must do all of this while producing visible progress at a pace fast enough to justify continued investment, but slow enough to be technically responsible. No post-Apollo lunar program has survived this gauntlet. Not one. The Space Exploration Initiative of 1989 was dead within 2 years. The Constellation program of 2004 was cancelled after 6 years. Even Artemis, which has survived 1 presidential transition and currently enjoys bipartisan support, has seen its timeline stretched and its architecture modified through successive budget cycles. The pattern is not a series of individual failures. It is a structural characteristic of how democratic governance interacts with long-duration engineering programs. Some observers conclude from this history that sustained lunar presence is politically impossible, that democratic societies are constitutionally incapable of maintaining the kind of multi-decade commitment that permanent space infrastructure requires. This conclusion is understandable but premature, because there is at least one significant counterexample that demonstrates democratic governance can sustain complex space programs across multiple administrations when the institutional structures are designed correctly. The International Space Station has maintained continuous human habitation since November of the year 2000. That is over 25 years of uninterrupted crewed operations spanning 5 American presidential administrations, numerous congressional turnovers, and at least 2 major economic crises. The station survived the Columbia disaster and the subsequent grounding of the shuttle fleet. It survived the end of the shuttle program entirely, transitioning crew transportation to Russian Soyuz vehicles and then to commercial American spacecraft. It survived geopolitical tensions with Russia that, in other contexts, might have fractured the partnership. How did the station survive when lunar programs did not? Several factors contributed, and each offers lessons for Artemis and its successors. First, the station created international dependencies that raised the cost of cancellation beyond what any single partner was willing to pay. When the European Space Agency builds a module, when the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency contributes a laboratory, when the Canadian Space Agency provides a robotic arm, cancelling the program means not just writing off domestic investment, but damaging diplomatic relationships with allies whose cooperation is needed across dozens of other policy domains. The station embedded itself in a web of international commitments that no administration could easily unravel. Second, the station distributed economic benefits across enough congressional districts to create a domestic political constituency for its continuation. Components were manufactured in multiple states. Operations were managed from centers in Texas, Alabama, Florida, and elsewhere. Contracts supported thousands of jobs in communities where aerospace employment represented a significant fraction of the local economy. Cancelling the station meant eliminating those jobs, a political cost that incumbents in affected districts were unwilling to bear regardless of party affiliation. Third, the station produced continuous, visible results. Crews launched regularly. Science experiments generated publications. Astronauts became public figures who connected the program to ordinary citizens through social media, educational outreach, and live broadcasts from orbit. The station was never out of the public eye long enough for its existence to become abstract or forgettable. Artemis has begun adopting similar structural strategies, and this represents one of the most important but least discussed differences between the current program and its failed predecessors. The Artemis Accords, signed by over 40 nations as of recent count, establish a framework of shared principles for lunar exploration. These agreements are not binding treaties in the formal legal sense, but they create diplomatic expectations and institutional relationships that increase the political cost of American withdrawal. When Australia, Japan, the United Kingdom, Italy, and dozens of other nations sign onto a framework for cooperative lunar exploration, the United States cannot easily walk away without diplomatic consequences that extend far beyond space policy. More concretely, international partners are contributing hardware, The European Space Agency builds the service module for the Orion capsule, the section that provides propulsion, power, and life support during transit. This is not a symbolic gesture. It is a critical path contribution, without which Orion cannot fly. Japan is developing a pressurized lunar rover designed to allow astronauts to travel across the surface without wearing spacesuits, dramatically extending exploration range. Canada is contributing robotic systems for the Gateway. Each of these contributions creates a mutual dependency that binds partner nations to the program's continuation and makes unilateral American cancellation diplomatically costly. Commercial partnerships represent perhaps the most structurally significant innovation in Artemis compared to all previous lunar programs. And understanding why requires appreciating how fundamentally the commercial space industry has transformed since the last serious attempt at lunar return. When the Constellation program was cancelled in 2010, the commercial space sector was still proving itself. SpaceX had flown its Falcon 1 rocket only twice successfully. Blue Origin had not yet flown any orbital vehicle. The idea that private companies could develop, build, and operate human-rated spacecraft at costs dramatically lower than traditional government programs was promising but unproven. Today, the landscape is unrecognizable. SpaceX routinely launches and lands orbital-class rocket boosters, a capability that was considered technically improbable by many experts as recently as 2012. The company's Falcon 9 has become the most frequently flown orbital rocket in the world. Its Crew Dragon spacecraft has transported dozens of astronauts to the International Space Station under NASA contract at per-seat costs, roughly 1/4 of what the shuttle charged. The company's Starship vehicle, currently in active flight testing, is designed to be the largest and most powerful, fully reusable launch system ever built. Blue Origin, while further behind in operational capability, is developing the New Glenn heavy-lift rocket and has been selected to build a separate human landing system for later Artemis missions. Rocket Lab, Relativity Space, and other companies are expanding the industrial base for launch vehicles and spacecraft components. The commercial space ecosystem now includes dozens of companies capable of contributing to lunar exploration at various levels of the supply chain. This commercial depth matters for program survivability in a way that is easy to understate. When SpaceX develops the Starship human landing system for Artemis, it does so under a contract structure where NASA pays milestone-based fees while SpaceX invests substantial private capital in the underlying vehicle development. Starship is not being built solely for NASA. It is being built as a general-purpose transportation system with commercial satellite launch, point-to-point Earth transport, and private spaceflight applications. The lunar landing mission is one use case among many. This means that even if NASA's specific lunar program were disrupted by a budget cut or a change in administration, the fundamental vehicle development would likely continue. SpaceX has independent commercial motivation to complete Starship regardless of government lunar policy. The technology base for lunar access becomes partially decoupled from the political cycles that have destroyed every previous lunar program. This decoupling is genuinely new. It did not exist during Constellation. It barely existed during the early years of Artemis. It represents a structural resilience that no government-only program can replicate. The same logic applies to other commercial participants. Companies developing lunar rovers, surface power systems, communication relays, and resource prospecting equipment under NASA contracts are building capabilities with commercial applications beyond NASA's specific program. Lunar surface access has begun attracting private investment from entities interested in resource extraction, tourism, scientific research, and communication infrastructure. These commercial interests create constituencies for lunar development that exist independently of any single government program. None of this guarantees success. Commercial partnerships introduce their own risks, schedule uncertainty, technical challenges, and the possibility that key companies could face financial difficulties or strategic pivots that delay critical program elements. Starship's development timeline has proven difficult to predict, and the gap between prototype testing and crew-rated operational flights remains significant. but the structural advantage of a distributed commercial base, compared to the single contractor government program model of previous eras, is substantial and historically unprecedented. Budget scale remains the most persistent constraint, and honesty requires acknowledging that modern lunar programs operate at resource levels far below what Apollo commanded. NASA's annual budget for exploration systems has grown in recent years but still represents a fraction of Apollo-era investment when measured as a share of federal spending. This means that capabilities which Apollo developed in years will take Artemis a decade or more. The pace is not primarily a reflection of engineering difficulty, it is a reflection of funding levels. Some analysts argue that commercial efficiencies and modern technology can close this gap, and there is partial evidence to support that view. SpaceX has demonstrated that iterative development with high flight rates can produce capabilities at dramatically lower costs than traditional approaches. The company's philosophy: build hardware rapidly, test aggressively, accept failures as data, iterate, quickly compresses development timelines in ways that traditional programs, with their emphasis on extensive pre-flight analysis and risk avoidance, cannot match. But iterative development at this pace carries a tension with human spaceflight requirements that has not yet been fully resolved. Starship prototypes have experienced dramatic failures during testing: explosive disassemblies, loss of vehicle control, landing mishaps. Each of these is an expected and accepted part of the development process within SpaceX's engineering culture. Each also generates media coverage and public commentary that could, in a different political environment, undermine congressional support for the program. Managing the relationship between aggressive commercial development and the public confidence necessary for sustained political support is an ongoing challenge without clear historical precedent. The geopolitical dimension of modern lunar return deserves careful examination because it represents both an opportunity and a risk. China's space program has achieved remarkable milestones over the past decade. The Chang'e missions have successfully landed robotic spacecraft on the lunar surface, including the first ever landing on the far side of the Moon, with Chang'e 4 in 2019. Chang'e 5 returned lunar samples to Earth in 2020. China has announced plans for crewed lunar landing by approximately 2030 and has partnered with Russia to develop the International Lunar Research Station, a permanent surface outpost intended to begin construction in the late 2020s and early 2030s. These ambitions have concentrated attention among Western policymakers on the strategic importance of maintaining leadership in space exploration. Congressional support for Artemis has been bolstered by the explicit recognition that the United States faces a credible competitor in cislunar space for the first time since the Soviet era. This competitive dynamic provides political motivation for sustained investment that purely scientific or economic arguments have historically failed to generate. But competition also carries the risk of repeating Apollo's central structural flaw. If lunar return becomes framed primarily as a race against China, a contest to plant flags and claim prestige before a rival does, the resulting program could prioritize speed over sustainability, spectacle over infrastructure, and political timelines over engineering realities. A crash program designed to beat China to the South Pole by 2028 would face exactly the pressures that made Apollo magnificent and unsustainable: compressed schedules, elevated risk tolerance, and an architecture optimized for a single achievement rather than lasting capability. The most productive outcome would be competition that motivates investment, while program architecture ensures that the resulting capabilities serve long-term goals rather than short-term prestige. This requires political leaders who understand the difference between a race and a construction project. Leaders willing to accept that arriving at the Moon second, with infrastructure designed for permanence, is strategically superior to arriving first with a program that cannot be sustained. The legal framework for sustained lunar presence adds a dimension that Apollo never confronted, and that remains incompletely resolved. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, ratified by all major spacefaring nations, prohibits national sovereignty claims over celestial bodies. No nation can plant a flag on the Moon and declare the surrounding territory its own. This principle is broadly accepted and unlikely to be challenged directly, but the treaty does not explicitly address the extraction and use of lunar resources. If a nation or company mines water ice from a permanently shadowed crater and processes it into rocket propellant, does that constitute appropriation of a celestial body? Or is it analogous to fishing in international waters, extracting resources from a shared commons without claiming sovereignty over the commons itself? The Artemis Accords attempt to establish norms around this question, asserting that resource extraction is consistent with the Outer Space Treaty and encouraging transparency and conflict avoidance in the selection and use of operational zones. But not all spacefaring nations have signed the accords. China and Russia have declined, and their planned International Lunar Research Station operates under a separate framework. The potential for competing legal interpretations and overlapping operational zones in resource-rich polar regions introduces a geopolitical complexity that will require diplomatic management extending well beyond any single space program. Where does all of this leave us? What is the honest assessment of where humanity stands in its attempt to return to the moon permanently? The engineering challenges are real but solvable. Closed-loop life support, radiation protection, thermal management, surface power, in-situ resource utilization, and dust mitigation are all problems with identified solution paths. None requires a breakthrough in fundamental physics. All require sustained investment in development, testing, and operational qualification. The industrial base is rebuilding. Not from the wreckage of Apollo, that capability has gone beyond recovery, but from a new foundation of commercial space companies, international partnerships, and modern manufacturing techniques. This new base is in many ways more resilient than Apollo's because it is distributed across multiple organizations with independent motivations for continued investment. The political alignment is more favorable than at any point since 1972. Bipartisan support for Artemis, international participation, commercial engagement, and competitive pressure from China create a combination of motivating factors that no previous post-Apollo program has enjoyed. This does not guarantee survival through future political transitions, but it improves the odds compared to programs that depended solely on the enthusiasm of a single administration. The timeline will be long, not Apollo long, not 8 years from announcement to landing, but decades from program initiation to mature surface operations. The first Artemis landing, whenever it occurs, will not be the culmination of the effort. It will be the beginning. The years and decades following that first landing will determine whether it becomes another Apollo, a magnificent dead end, or the first step towards something permanent. Success requires a form of commitment that democratic societies find deeply uncomfortable. It requires spending money today for benefits that will materialize during the terms of future leaders. It requires accepting that the program will not be completed before the next election, or the election after that, or possibly the election after that. It requires tolerating setbacks, delays, and cost growth without abandoning the objective. It requires sustaining institutional focus across the inevitable personnel transitions, budget fluctuations, and shifting priorities that characterize democratic governance over multi-decade timescales. Humanity has demonstrated this kind of patience before, though rarely and never easily. The great infrastructure projects of the 19th and 20th centuries, transcontinental railways, the Panama Canal, the interstate highway system required decades of sustained investment through political transitions, economic disruptions, and fierce public debate. They succeeded not because every participant agreed on every detail, but because a broad enough coalition recognized the long-term value of the endeavor and fought to sustain it through the inevitable difficulties. The moon demands the same kind of commitment, not the frenzied urgency of Apollo, which burned hot and bright and extinguished itself in less than a decade. Something steadier, something less dramatic but more durable. The slow, unglamorous, budget-constrained work of building infrastructure that outlasts the people who authorize it. We did not fail to return to the moon because it was impossible. We did not return because the extraordinary conditions that made Apollo possible, the existential threat, the unlimited budget, the tolerance for mortal risk, the singular national purpose dissolved the moment the political objective was achieved. What followed was not failure but normalcy. And normalcy, it turns out, is a far harder environment in which to do extraordinary things. The conditions for a permanent return are assembling. Not perfectly, not quickly, not without frustration and setback, and the persistent risk that political cycles will once again disrupt what engineering has begun. But the trajectory, for the first time in half a century, is genuinely aimed at the lunar surface. Not because of a crisis, not because of a race, but because enough people, in enough institutions, across enough nations, have begun the difficult work of building something designed to last. The moon is 3 days away. It has always been 3 days away. The distance that remains is not measured in kilometers. It is measured in the political will to sustain funding across administrations, the industrial commitment to develop hardware over decades, the international cooperation to share costs and risks, and the institutional patience to absorb setbacks without abandoning the objective. That distance is closing, imperfectly, slowly, with the maddening unevenness that characterizes every ambitious undertaking in a democratic society. But it is closing. The 12 astronauts who walked on the moon did so under conditions that cannot be recreated. They were the product of a unique moment, a moment of fear and ambition and political will, concentrated into the most extraordinary engineering sprint in human history. What they accomplished was not the beginning of an era, it was the peak of a crisis. What comes next, if it comes, will look nothing like Apollo. It will be slower, more complex, more international, more commercial, and more sustainable. It will not produce the same breathtaking sense of sudden achievement. There will be no single moment when a nation holds its breath and watches a grainy television feed of boots touching alien soil for the first time. Instead, there will be the gradual, incremental, often invisible accumulation of capability, a habitat tested, a power system deployed, a water extraction experiment conducted, a crew rotation completed, another, and another, and another, until the presence is no longer an event but a fact. That is how civilizations build things that last. Not in sprints but in sustained effort. Not through crisis but through commitment. The moon waits, as it has always waited. Patient, silent, indifferent to human timelines and political cycles. It does not care whether we return in 2027 or 2035 or 2050. It will be there whenever we arrive with the tools and the will to stay. The question was never whether we could go back. The question was always whether we could build the kind of civilization that finishes what it starts. That question remains open. The answer depends not on rockets or habitats or power systems. It depends on us, on whether we possess the rarest and most difficult of human virtues, not courage, which flares bright in moments of crisis, but patience, which endures across the long, quiet years when no one is watching and the work is hard and the finish line is nowhere in sight. Apollo proved we could be bold. The half-century that followed proved that boldness alone is not enough. What the moon requires now is something harder than boldness. It requires steadiness. And whether humanity can supply that steadiness, across decades, across administrations, across the 1,000 competing demands of ordinary democratic life, is the only question that truly matters. The moon is close. It has always been close. We are the ones who have to decide to stay the course long enough to reach it.